psychedelics myself.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so many technical issues because I have never ever done this before, but it's very exciting. So here's what's happening. Today we're doing our very first panel live with other guests. As everybody knows, I do 2 interviews a week, and those are all pre-recorded. This is a live panel show, and I'm going to be joined by Jesse Hirsh from the MetaViews podcast. I've been on his show, he's been on mine. We've had great conversation. Instantly, that conversation is what spawned this live, in so much as he and I have been having an ongoing conversation about what the left, the Democratic National Committee, all this type of thing can do to build up a left-wing new media ecosystem like what the right has, obviously in an age of misinformation, disinformation, all this type of thing. The 2024 election has shown that this is more important than ever before. So we're decided to do this live. So Jesse Hirsch is going to be here to talk about that. And then, in addition to that, I have managed to pry him into doing this. David Beckemeyer from the Outrage Overload podcast is here. I've done a couple things with him. Although, interestingly, last night I couldn't find the solo version of my podcast with him, but I found the housing one. Very weird. Anyway, he is great and lovely, and I wanted to talk to him because he's on the front lines of this, and he has lots of great connections in media. He is suffering today because it is 48 degrees in Los Angeles, which for them is practically a cold snap. Never mind, I'm sitting in Connecticut, it's 28 degrees and snowing, but, and just as in Canada, and they're just frozen. Canada is a frozen wasteland with hockey and maple syrup. So, I'm going to bring them on, and we're going to have this great conversation. So, I said I'm going to bring them on. I've only done this once before, so we're going to bear with me as I try this. So, number one, we're going to add here. There's one of you. And there's two of you. So, theoretically, everybody should be able to hopefully see themselves, see each other, because I have you all three in a panel situation. So, how are we doing so far?
Hanging out.
Okay, good. Excellent. All right, so, let me start the conversation by moving this bug below David's chin so that he's not covered up by the Cameron Journal logo. So yes, and is that far as over it can go? Yes, it is. Okay, good. So excellent. So let me start off the conversation by asking you both to introduce yourselves. Jesse, you go first, and then David, and then we'll talk about the left in new media.
My name's Jesse. Under normal circumstances, you could argue I'm presently engaged in a form of foreign interference since we are here to discuss American politics and the Democratic Party. But since Canada is directly under threat and regularly being referred to as the 51st state, I thought I'd get ahead of the curve and anticipate a time in which we are all fellow constituents on some level. So a little bit of shit disturber, a little bit of futurist, a little bit of community organizer, here to have a good time.
Excellent. And David?
Hey everybody, I'm David Beckemeyer. I am in California and I host a show called Outrage Overload, and I recently kind of reevaluated, or at least kind of considered what we're doing in the context of sort of the new world we're in. And so I was having a bit of I wouldn't, it was over dramatic to say sort of a crisis in faith, but it's along those lines. And so anyway, I sort of rethought about that, and I think my show is kind of one to build resilience, and also to help in providing means to civically engage in effective ways.
Excellent. All right. Well, I put your names up presently to help people keep it straight. Because I literally just now discovered I could do that. Again, This is the first time I've ever done this with like multiple people. Usually I use this live function to the news hour on Mondays, and that's kind of it. Or if I want to record stuff on the screen, that's kind of it. So, this is an all new, we're breaking new ground. But while we break new ground technically here at the Cameron Journal, we're going to break some new ground intellectually. And because Jesse, you and I have talked about this a lot already, I'm going to start with David first. We're going to circle back to you. Um, so obviously we've been having this conversation about what's been going on in the country, media information, disinformation, how that affected the 2024 election. As I joked over email, it's not a coup if it doesn't come from the coup region of France. It's just sparkling autocracy. And I've had that one in my back pocket since 2017. And so I wanted to, because the listeners have already heard me and Jesse go on about this for 2 hours of content, I wanted to talk with you and how you feel about America's information ecosystem and what the left is missing in the world of podcasts and lives and the stuff that we do. And so I thought we'd start with you.
Oh, okay, sure. Start with the guy that doesn't know much about all these things. No, yeah, I'd say. Well, I mean, I think one thing we have to kind of keep in mind in this, you see a lot of people saying, well, the left should just sort of do exactly what the right has been doing, or how they do it, and we sort of know that doesn't work. Like, uh, in other words, some of the kind of in your face kind of styles like a Limbaugh or something like that, we know doesn't really. In fact, wasn't it On America or something like that? Somebody sort of tried that a while ago, like a radio shows that were sort of like the guy even
John
sounded like Limbaugh.
Fugelsang kind of tried that. Air America kind of tried that. This is 10, 15 years ago at this point now.
Right.
And that was Air America was a whole Al Gore involved thing. They raised a bunch of money. He sold that to I think the Qataris for some amount of money that for them is a minor rounding error, a small accounting problem sort of thing. And then they eventually closed it down because what the hell do you do with it? So yeah, I mean it has been tried and it's not gotten anywhere.
Right. So there's different styles, that that in your face style just was a turn off for the in general to the folks on the left. So
Right.
that, like, when people talk about just doing everything the right does, that's not really what you want to do. You have to do something that actually can be effective. And to some degree, the right could argue that the left has that in the form of the late night comedians, right? That's kind of the version of Tucker Carlson. I mean, that's at least how it's evolved, right? I mean, they're every night telling half the country they're dumb, and they don't mind making fun of half the country. And so that's kind of so it's kind of like, if you read Outrage and Irony, it's kind of it sort of talks about this, by Daniel Young. And but I think there's something that has to happen, that I don't have a better word for it than sort of positive propaganda, in the sense that the other thing people pit as opposites, that's a mischaracterization, is disinformation. The opposite of disinformation is good journalism, and it's not, right? Those are two different things that are having a different objectives, right? Disinformation is, in by definition, sort of trying to get you to act, or trying to get you to try to have an outcome, trying to have produce some kind of an effect. Whereas good journalism, the idea is all it's doing is presenting all the evidence, and then you decide whatever you want, right? So you don't counter disinformation with good journalism. I'm not saying you shouldn't have good journalism, or at least, when I say, I'm using this word good journalism, what I should say is the kind of things that people keep saying is what they want in journalism, where they want everything to be reported fairly and evenly, and that's all we want, is just give us the facts. If that were even possible, and if you heard that, that would still not counter the disinformation campaigns and the propaganda campaigns out there. So somehow we need, positive propaganda, again, for lack of a better term. And I think that's, what that how you define that and how you make it happen. But that's, I think, what's one thing that's missing.
Can, can,
Yes.
can I jump in
Yeah.
there?
Please do.
I love that phrase of positive propaganda, and I think to justify it or to contrast, propaganda on the right is about fear, manipulation, and lies, and I think propaganda on the left begins with dialogue. Like, it begins with different voices. It begins with empowering different voices, because we don't have the same desire for homogeneity. We don't have the same desire for a unified voice. And this is where I think the paradox is good propaganda is grassroots propaganda. It's propaganda that kind of comes on its own in a strong ecosystem compared to the top-down propaganda of the right. So I think David's onto something, and we came into this conversation under the larger rubric of what are the supports, what's the necessary environment, either from institutional perspective or a funding perspective. But I think when we get into the methods of good propaganda, I think it's firmly rooted in a kind of grassroots culture.
Yes, and I want to think about that for a moment in terms of how on earth are we ever going to develop that? Because it seems like there's just so, I don't know. They're just
Develop which?
um how we develop that grassroots desire for a new kind of media. And I say this as someone who has been doing this in some form for almost 10 years. And I do very old fashioned Edward R. Murrow news. Um, and it's not, it's not the same as what like a David Pakman does or Kyle Kalinske or anything like that. And it's, I'll be honest, it's been hard to get a lot of traction for that. Only just now, especially thanks to TikTok and YouTube Shorts, have I finally started to get something happening. Um, and so I kind of wonder, and this kind of gets into the, is maybe the problem that the left controls mainstream media for better or for worse. Um, and there's just not a lot of room for us. Whereas the right really only has Fox and to a much lesser extent OAN and Newsmax. And so especially, and this is especially like with, when you get into Rush Limbaugh, Michael Medved, Michael Savage, all the big old AM radio guys, there was a dearth of that view. Ergo demand. Ergo an ecosystem developed. Um but I also wonder, with the trust in mainstream media being so low these days, you'd think an alternative would pop up, sort of thing. Um, and I kind of wonder why that still hasn't happened yet. I think that's interesting.
I mean, the short answer, and David, I'd love to hear what you think, is there's only a certain amount of oxygen in the room. And if all that oxygen is going to MSNBC, if all that oxygen is going to the New York Times podcasts or, NPR podcasts, then to go back to your point about the algorithms, with the exception of TikTok and to a lesser extent YouTube Shorts, all the existing algorithms reinforce what's already popular. The
Right.
reason that TikTok has been such a boon to left voices in North America is because it's focused on discovery. It's focused on platforming new voices, regardless of their politics.
Right.
And I think that part of what we should be talking about is not just, hey, we need to have a healthy information ecosphere. We need to have a healthy, public debate. To David's point, that's not just, people yelling at each other, but actually gets to civil dialogue. It's that or it's no democracy. I think we have the moral high ground for once when, to your point, mainstream media has kind of been spinning this thing of, ignore social media. It's all trolls. Ignore podcasting. It's all, people who aren't experts. When instead, I think we should be arguing what we're looking for is a grassroots alternative.
David, let's bounce to you on that. What do you kind of agree with this idea that the mainstream media is sucking up too much oxygen, therefore the rest of us starve?
Well, as Jesse noted, it's not even the quote unquote traditional or mainstream media. It's also sort of the larger podcasts, right? I mean, Joe Rogan sucks a lot of energy out of the room, and that, obviously not a left leaning guy, but he sucks a lot of energy out of the room. Um, so it does leave a little bit. It's a little harder to find that spot where we can land. But I will say, I think those trends are starting to happen. Like if you look at a lot of if you follow or look into the sort of stats people talking about, and so you both get sort of um, hard evidence with numbers, and you also just get these kind of a perception, right? You see people, some of these more qualitative kind of interviews where people are sort of talking about they're preferring these alternative sources, and it is not only these larger well-known podcasts but smaller ones too. And obviously, you do still have problems with who's doing good journalism, or in other words, who's following some of the ethics and the important stuff about sources and vetting, and are you fact checking, and do you have an editor maybe, or if somebody that checks you, at least this kind of thing. But so the quality can vary quite a bit, but I mean, so you're seeing a little bit of a movement to that, and so I'm encouraged by that. And in fact, I think I saw a recent stat about something like, I forget, it was a large percentage of folks trusted podcasts way more than traditional sources.
And I
Absolutely.
think also, to go back to that point of trust, there's a lot of intimacy in podcasting. And I find, even in my own context, where I'm reaching really quite a modest audience, but it's my community, right? It's my friends, it's my family. And for that to be the basis upon which, as citizens, we become informed, to go to your point, David, that there are certain methods, I think, that journalists have developed that we can adopt, that create that kind of credibility, that create that kind of authority. That's where I'm like, we don't need one Joe Rogan, we need 10,000. And that's what's going to make a real difference in terms of creating a healthy kind of a media environment for democracy.
Well, and this gets, as you know, I love historical context. That's kind of my thing. Um, the early days of the newspaper business. That's what it was. New York City at one time had six newspapers. I'll go with six because I can name all of them. So there was at least six that I can think of. Had six newspapers, so you could have, even Manhattan, there was a newspaper below Central Park, and there was newspapers for Midtown and above. I mean, it was that small and granular sort of thing. The idea of the big citywide daily that in no way can cover everything going on, not even close, was kind of a bit of was something that came later in consolidation and all this type of thing. I remember even thinking, like, growing up in Denver, we had two newspapers and eventually only one. We had the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News. The Rocky Mountain News was this legendary sort of publication. It had broken some major stories and this sort of thing. And they were different formats. Rocky Mountain News was tabloid. Denver Post was the traditional folded style. And I remember, growing up, reading. We were Denver Post people, not Rocky Mountain News people, and that was in the '90s. That was a big, who you took was a big controversy, and how much they didn't cover the suburbs, because Denver is a very small city. It doesn't occupy, the city and county of is very small, but it's surrounded by this huge ring of suburbs. It's even bigger now. It goes all the way to Boulder. And Boulder was so far away. It had its own great paper, the Daily Camera in Boulder. And they just didn't seem to cover stuff going on around us. They kind of forgot about us. The TV news stations, if you watched Denver news in the '90s, you'd think, what suburbs? The whole city ends, at I-25 and I-70, sort of thing. And that, I mean, newspapers, it used to be that granular, and obviously it costs a lot of money to do that. Not all neighborhoods can support publications. In New York, even immigrant communities had publications. So, long story of historical context to say, this idea of, relatively small, you know, journalists covering stories that matter to certain groups or communities that have been gathered together, there is a kind of this historical precedent. That's how journalism used to work. And perhaps to your point, it's time to get back to that. Rather than, the big, giant sort of mass media, mass broadcasting, mass everything sort of thing. I think the problem in that, though, is there's a business model issue. You can't attract advertisers unless you have an audience of a certain size. And that then it makes it difficult
But
to, can someone get paid to do this, or do we have to do it on our nights and weekends around the children and the chickens?
so I think in the spirit of how we started this conversation, we should remember the brainstorm rules. That right now we're not trying to cut off any doors, we're just trying to open doors.
Right.
And to your point, I think part of that evaluative criteria is, well, what should, like, because in your historical example, you sort of inferred what is the average community size that has the business model that could support a community newspaper.
Right.
And with podcasting, that's different. Because with podcasting, you're not limited to how far the paper boys can throw the newspapers.
True.
But your question is valid, which is how much of an audience, and again, this varies because some audiences are more engaged and therefore more valuable to advertisers and sponsors than others. But nonetheless, what kind of an audience is required for a podcast to be sustainable, at the very least as a part-time job? Right? So that you could do it in addition to your full-time job or have multiple side hustles. I think that would be a worthwhile question for us to explore. Not in this episode because, it's not, it's worth quantifying. And there are, to David's points, empirical studies now available that can actually help us zero it in. But here's my crazy idea that I came up with today while I was sort of thinking about our chat. And it gets into what we discussed the last time. On the one hand, I feel we have a moral high ground right now. I feel that not only are those who support democracy, small d, going, oh my God, what's going on? What are we going to do? But, to David's work, we are reaching a consensus amongst those people that the information sphere is broken, that the propaganda is out of control, that we are at a disadvantage. We are coming to we're taking a knife to a gunfight, almost all the informational and media and debate scenarios. So, précis aside, here's my idea: a podcasters union. And the podcasters union is not your traditional union in the sense that, like, iHeartRadio, their podcast division, is actually unionized and they have a local. But I mean like us, because we are almost sole proprietors, right? We're people who, we are the labor behind it, but we're also kind of small business people. So it's more podcast union in the sense of join the union, where we'll have best practices on how to do interviews and how to be credible and, ideas on how to trend on TikTok. So you see this in terms of podcast networks all the time, but they don't have the union vibe, the kind of political thing of saying, this is about us raising all boats, and to the point of union, here are our economic demands, right? Podcasters in the US should maybe have access to healthcare plans. Podcasters should have access to an ad network that makes it easier to get in touch with, the Ben and Jerry's of the world and other advertisers who want to reach. Like, I'm riffing now, I'm babbling, I'll shut up. But that's the general idea. I'm curious what you guys think.
David, I'll let you go first.
Well, and it also feels like there's another side of that's not exactly the union side, which I do love that. Figuring out how to do it and all that is always got to work out those details, delves in the details. But there's also another aspect that reminds me of, like, if anyone remembers kind of the UL, like with electricity, right? There was this idea that you could be a member of that. Now, I don't know if that model's perfect because you had to pay and there was a lot of other stuff. But this idea that you could sort of be certified that you met certain quality certifications or minimums standards. I think that's something that could help too, that we could have something like that as part of it as well. And you can maybe decide which level you want to be at. Like, I have a comedy show, I don't care. This level's fine for me, right? I'm not pretending to provide facts. I'm just giving you jokes. But you could sort of do something like that too, that would maybe give us a little bit more credibility there too, because like you say, the mainstream is always saying I mean, I think they're finally getting it. They're starting to get it that podcasts are a threat to them, but that's one of their techniques, is always saying, oh, these guys don't know what they're doing. I mean, I heard Chris Cuomo saying that just yesterday, like, oh, these dumb guys on the podcast are saying all these things. It's like, dude, you better start paying attention to them a little bit more. But but yeah, I love that idea. Something else I think that's a little bit relevant, and I don't know why it's relevant, but just in my goofy brain, it seems a little bit relevant. Tobias Rose Stockwell, he wrote that. He's done a lot of writing in this space, but he has a book, Outrage Machine, I think it's called. He talked about this idea of like a relay race. And how things kind of, as the internet came out, you talk about historical context too, as well. Another thing that made me think about this is that, as the internet kind of replaced or supplanted some of these things, there was like a handoff. Like if you look at encyclopedia, the handoff was like Wikipedia, right? And that's a pretty good handoff. Wikipedia is pretty good. You could say it's better. There used to be people that sold. For anybody that doesn't know, there were people that walked door to door and sold like sets of encyclopedias back in the day. We had one from the 50s when I was a kid. I was still learning. I'm not that old, so I was learning from really old encyclopedias off my bookshelf. But I actually love the things. But that's kind of the nerd dork that I am. Another handoff was like, you could say librarians, right? We still have librarians. We should have still librarians. I'm a huge supporter of libraries. But, there was also like this, I'm going to go to the library and I'm going to ask the librarian. Well, now who do you go to? You go to Google, right? And it's pretty good, right? It's often the answer is pretty good and you get it right away. You have all this massive amount of information. When he talks about there was no handoff for news media, right? We didn't get that handoff right. It was sort of maybe supposed to be social media, but they didn't get it right. They didn't do it. It doesn't meet those criteria. It doesn't serve the same role. This kind of thing. So we never had a handoff for news. Like the handoff was NewYorkTimes.com. Like, no, that's not an internet version of whatever the internet version
Which
should
was
be, right?
terrible
So
for
I think that's
years.
where maybe
I mean,
right, it still is, right? I mean, more or less, it
Yeah.
still is, right? But
right.
but and so maybe that's where podcasts can be. Like we can be that handoff to get news right in an internet age.
No, I mean, I think there's, I think having the idea of some sort of union of coming together, and having some set standards is definitely helpful. I feel like it's going to take someone a bit bigger to lead that, um, sort of thing, because I think you've got to have, reasonably well known people in charge of that. I mean, it would be nice if, the Young Turks would take that on, sort of
But
thing.
to get back to the startup mindset, our hero, our Steve Jobs will come later,
Yeah.
right? Like first, like I did Google, like there's no one as a concept, there's no one doing this, right?
Right.
The closest that has come to this is like iHeartRadio, and there's a couple other workplaces where they've unionized staff, and that's generally under the Writers Guild of America. But there's no one who's saying, hey, let's create a kind of mutual aid society for podcasts. Podmatch.com is close. And
Yeah.
podmatch.com happens to be the factory floor where we can organize a lot of people into the podcasters union. And I would
Sure.
reckon that once you had a critical mass, that's where you'd attract your Young Turks. That's where you'd attract, your people who have the time and the wherewithal to take this to the next level and start attracting some of and again, I am just thinking within the context of I'm spending more time day after day talking to other people who do podcasts, and I'm more and more having conversations with people who do podcasts. So it's a real easy thing of like, hey, join the union, and initially it could be totally free because there's no benefits. And
Right.
then once there's enough momentum, then you have 50 people who could talk and say, all right, how do we take this to the next level? So it's like MVP,
Yeah.
minimal viable product, and just start saying, let's occupy the political space. So when the DNC goes, who's out there organizing the lefty podcast? They Google and there we are.
No, yes, I think that pathway, there's definitely a pathway forward for that. That's kind of what Black Lives Matter did. It was, despite its financial issues that are well documented, we will not get into right now. It started as the very kind of ground up organization sort of thing, of, the infamous few good, the few good men, few good people in their case, came together. That's kind of what
And,
holds democracy together.
and if I could just mention, many of them were from Toronto. Not a
Oh, I
lot
did
of
not know
people know
that. How
that.
handy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they moved to LA once it really took off, right? Because,
Yeah.
it was much more of an organizing center, but a lot of the leadership were from Toronto.
Well, not, yes. No. I think something like that is definitely a good, a good idea, perhaps something to start on and explore with, and start conversations with people and all this type of thing. I know how complicated it can be to bring people together in any sort of a podcast network. With my book publisher, we're moving to a media model, and we are starting a podcast network. We're more offering services and things like that, not anything as organic as what you're proposing. But getting people on board for it is no easy thing. I know, because a campaign was sent out from the marketing department and we got not much response, and then we had meetings, and we're kind of trying to figure out how to activate people and get them, even just wanting to reply to an email at this point, sort of thing. So it's no easy thing. But I mean, yes, I think as far as political economy goes, I think that conversation could be an important jumping off spot, and especially convincing people to come in and do this, and then as a community figure out, okay, what does this need to look like, what standards do we all need to be meeting, all this sort of thing. And then also going after bigger things like White House press credentials, which literally, I filled that out the other day, is right now a one-page form. They ask for almost no information. It's kind of embarrassing. But I have applied. Because I live close enough to DC, I could show up from time to time. Sort of thing.
I'll be looking forward to that day.
Oh, yes, that'll be a whole thing if that ever happens. But yes, I mean, we and start to go after bigger stuff like that. But I also want to bring in another aspect of this conversation. Yes, I think organization is needed. Yes, I think we need to come together about that. We'll probably have more conversations about this over email as time goes on. I think the other half of this conversation is there's an accusation of one of the reasons why the left has a podcast problem is because we lost Joe Rogan. He endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016. The DNC did not embrace Bernie Sanders, as we know. And honestly, the Bernie Sanders to Trump pipeline is real and free flowing. Why do you think why do you think the right has been so successful in podcasting? How did we lose Joe Rogan? Basically, kind of how did we get here? I literally had a guest I recorded last week surprised because I was a liberal doing a podcast. And he said, that's unheard of. I've never been on a podcast where the person talking opposite has been liberal. And I'm kind of like, weird. Who's been booking you? Who have you booked with?
Yeah, they live in an
here?
insular world, right?
Yeah, I'm like, there's several quite popular shows. Like, I'm not quite sure who you're booking or who's booking you, but I mean, how did we lose Joe Rogan? How did we lose these other people?
I think you already answered the question, which was mainstream media, and the kind of look down your nose tone that, as much as I love her, Rachel Maddow kind of takes. And to your other point, the DNC ran Bernie and all his friends, right? Not so much out of the party. So this is why I started, and I keep coming back to grassroots. Now, I think where I really enjoy David's perspective is that it's not just grassroots the way the right's grassroots, which is anything goes. I think there's an opportunity here to talk about trust, to talk about credibility, to talk about methods that build rather than destroy. And I mean that both in the knowledge sense as well as the community sense. But I think you're absolutely right that there was a pipeline from the left to the alt-right. And I think we shut off that pipeline by giving the left a place to talk that the mainstream media and the DNC have not.
David?
Well, Cameron, you and I have talked before about, kind of this idea of the left is very unforgiving, right? So whereas the right tends to be really welcoming. Like if you J.D. Vance called Trump Nazi or something like that, or the closest thing to Hitler, so many years ago, and here he is embraced in the party, right? The left just doesn't do that, right? Once you break the rules or whatever, you're out. We'll never talk to you again. You're immoral. You're a terrible person, and there's no place for you to come back. And I think that's part of it, right? I mean, I think that's a piece of it. And because if you think about from Obama and the early stages of Obama, really latching on to technology and leveraging it, and technology of the state back then, it's a lot different than now. But and then who owns technology now, right? I mean, Trump just blew the Harris campaign away and how he dealt with the more modern platforms, right? Or the podcasts, everything, right? Social media, all of it. He just blew Harris
Which is
away,
insane to me
even
because
with
we're
less
the
money.
left, we're the artists, we're the creatives, we're the people
Right,
that do
right.
all of this stuff, and somehow our political party completely drops the ball. Sort of. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, I think
Well,
so.
I
Those are a
think
couple things. I think another one that we haven't touched on a little bit, and we did a little bit because we said like sort of the left kind of owns mainstream media, and I think this is a challenge that is actually hurting the left, quote unquote, at this point, right? Because they are the establishment, but they won't platform, they won't message as the establishment. They keep messaging as though they're the Revolutionary Party, and they're not, right? They're actually the establishment at this point. So what are they going to do to tell us as the establishment? Here's how we can still help you. I mean, we played the drinking game at the one of the debates where we took a drink every time Kamala Harris said middle class, right? Because we
Yeah.
got pretty drunk, right? But it's like, okay, you're saying it, but what plans are you really bringing to the table, and how are you messaging those plans? Whereas and obviously some of this is BS, but some of it is messaging too, right? I mean, Trump only has to say, I feel you, I hear you, I see you're struggling. And that message comes across from him, even though he's a billionaire. I don't know all the reasons why, but the Democrats don't seem to have credibility on that, right? Because they're still selling the Handmaid's Tale story when they are the establishment. So where are the people that are actually from the middle class? Instead of a Schumer or a Pelosi, all these left coast and our coastal elites, give us somebody. You had Walls there, right? But that was maybe a attempt at this, but I think they have to get more credibility with that segment of the population, and do it in an honest way, not keep saying, they're bad, we're your only hope.
and there's key words there that I think is important: credibility, which I keep saying over and over and over, and honesty. And that's often what I think people feel is missing in the mainstream media. And I know, Cameron, you didn't want us to get too current affairs, but obviously Palestine is in the news. And
Yeah.
and for me, Palestine is a great example in which the Democrats didn't have to abandon Israel. But what they didn't do, what they should have done, is had open, honest conversations about Palestine that allowed people to talk about their concerns, that allowed Jewish folks and Arabs and Palestinians and Christians to have civil conversations about peace in the Middle East. I know that nobody thinks that's possible, but in the podcast world, it is. It does happen. And that is the kind of, I feel, dialogic methodology, the town hall conversation that everyone wishes digital media could achieve, that I think podcasting can, when you train hosts, when you train facilitators to be the kind of animators, conversation facilitators. And to go back to something you said earlier, David, as a joke, and I wanted to double down on it, I think even comedians who are members of the podcast union could say, I've taken anti-oppression training. It doesn't mean I'm woke, but it means I can do jokes without being an asshole. Or I've done political literacy training, so I can actually make jokes about politics without sounding stupid. And
Yeah.
there are a lot of comedians which are worried about that. And if we were to suggest that I'm choosing my words very uncarefully. I'm brainstorming here. But if we were to say that the ideology of podcasting is conversation, it's dialogue. It doesn't mean shaming people. It doesn't mean saying that people are right or wrong. It means let's listen. Let's have empathy. Let's have compassion. And then you frame that with a small d democratic values that alienates the MAGA folks and alienates, the right. Then you have an inclusive concept that doesn't tell people they're right or wrong, but gives us a tool to start engaging our communities, to start floating radical policies. Because look, my mission for 2025, and I haven't really started this yet, I'm just saying it so that I force myself to do it, is I want to become an abolitionist. And I mean abolish prisons and abolish the police. And I want to get into like a policy framework of how you do that. My whole life, I was the opposite of that. I thought, that'll never happen. And now I'm like, well, that's the craziest policy I could think of. So I can have conversations about it. again, as a way of trying to advance this, and podcasting is the only place I could do that. You could never have those conversations. You could never have that idea anywhere else. So that's why I think podcasting as a metaphor, as a media, the medium is the message, are really gives us a lot of advantage to shifting the power that MAGA has, the power that Trump has, in, to David's point, the anti-establishment ethos, because it's very alluring, it's very powerful, and it has the moral high ground when we should have the moral high ground.
David, I wanted to bounce off on your comments about the Democrats not acting like the establishment. I think it's because the people in charge of the party and who set the messaging and all this type of thing mostly came out of the 60s and 70s when the Democrats weren't the establishment. And they
Right.
still have that very old fashioned mentality. Meanwhile, in the intervening 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 decades, times have changed, and a lot of the institutions, they were successful. They captured institutions that held against them. They got into power. They used that power to change society. They made it so their children will never own a house. They, left us with a moribund job market. All this sort of thing. They have done it, and I think it's very uncomfortable for certain leaders in the party to act like that, message that, have that conversation, do that sort of thing, because that's not how they've ever approached politics in their entire lives. And nor do I think they want to, very honestly. And I think honestly, I think the only good thing about Trump and MAGA and this new thing is it puts the left in our favorite position, which is the underdog revolutionary new vision for the future. That's the only kind of bright side I see. And I think new media, if they embrace this, can be part of that. Now, to your point, when Hassan Piker went to the DNC and he was the only one invited, he wanted to talk about Palestine, and they didn't just throw him out of the convention, they threw him out of the building
Yeah.
because that topic was not to be touched on. And a lot of that has to do with funding. Because, as Ilhan Omar found out, the DNC takes a lot of money from Jewish organizations, and there are certain topics when you take those dollars that are just verboten. I'm not going to get into the right or wrong of that, but that's just how that works. Let's acknowledge reality.
But my point, just quickly on
And here
that,
we are.
a grassroots network can resist that, right? Because a
That's where no,
grassroots network,
that's where I was going is if there were enough of us together and enough power, then you get so big they can't ignore you. And then all of a sudden those organizations have to deal with the fact that some of us, many of us, especially if you're under 40 or 50, have a very different view of that conflict than other people do, and we're ready, willing, and able to have a very different conversation. And there's a dozen more examples, using that as the first one, a dozen more examples where that's also true.
so let me propose an interesting methodology, a meta
Let me put
methodology.
a
Sorry,
pause
go
on
ahead,
that because
Kevin.
David has something to say, and he hasn't spoken a
Sorry.
little bit. So, David, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say one thing that you said about it puts Democrats in this place they like to be, where they're the underdog or whatever. And you said something about they could drive back this revolutionary story. Except really, what people are seeing about what the Democrat when we talk about democracy, right? And
Mm-hmm.
what a lot of people see is what you're telling me is you want to go back to the status quo we had before, which I didn't like. So I think we've got to figure out how to get past that messaging too. That and maybe chaos will help you get there, and they'll be like, oh, I don't like this chaos as much as I thought I would. I don't know, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
but to some degree, that's what people see when we say, we want to enforce these democratic norms to get back to having a constitution, these kind of things. They see that as the status quo that they think's not serving them, and I think there has to be a lot of education there to say sort of there are probably there are I shouldn't say probably there are problems within these systems, but tearing them down is not the answer, right? I mean, it's repairing them and improving them and find the places that are broken, not wholesale replacing them, because if you wholesale replace them, you're going to end up rebuilding most of it. So you talk about that's efficiency. I don't know, that's the dumbest kind of efficiency I've ever heard of, because you're going to waste a huge amount of money and resources essentially rebuilding a lot of what we have now, if your first step is to simply burn it all down. So I think that's a message that we need to really improve on.
Well, and education, I think, is another kind of through line to this, of which I think podcasting is the medium of contemporary education. But allow me to be the doomsayer and think I think the administration is going to get a whole lot worse, especially given the pace that they're headed. So here's my kind of next step proposal, because on the one hand, because I'm thinking out loud, this entire conversation I've really enjoyed, partly because it's allowing me to listen and fuse and synthesize all of our ideas, and I think that's the methodology. So here's my proposal. We continue rolling forward a series of conversations where next time we each have to bring a new person. And every time each person has to bring a new person, right? So it's still at the level of conversation. It's still at the level of kind of town hall or town forum. But imagine it this way. Like right now, international diplomacy, even before Trump, has been a mess. And the way they deal with it, like the BRICS countries, for example, is they just like rotate which country convenes the meeting. So it's all like we're independent republics, right? All these independent podcasters who each are their own republics. And each of us, ironically, have a venue in which we can convene other podcasters and bring them together. So we have both a methodology, conversation, we've got a venue, our podcast, and then each time we start expanding the people, podcasters who we're including, just so that we can continue this conversation, right? As a way of both scaling in a small grassroots way, but I don't know about you guys. I really enjoyed this conversation. If we keep having enjoyable conversations, that in and of itself achieves that culture that we were describing at the outset in a very bottom up way that eventually people are like, I want to get in on that conversation.
No, certainly. I mean, I think that's definitely an initial pathway forward. And this is something. It's kind of I one of the things I find interesting is there's much more of an impetus for this now than there was in 2017, which I think is very interesting. But I also feel like the market and sway has changed. I some people will know this, some people won't. There's a really great content creator newsletter organization called Passion Fruit, and during the election in August, when we were doing the big switch from Biden to Harris, we were talking about, this was the influencer election, and kind of at that moment we thought that kind of meant, us on the left, sort of with Harris, sort of thing, not necessarily Trump on the right, sort of thing. And boy, we get that. We were right about the influencer part, wrong about who was going to benefit. And I was thinking, my, how times have changed. Where, in in the first term with the whole resistance movement, it was, resisting in certain organizations with certain people or within the government or marches or protests or all this type of thing. And I think this time around, because the left has so collapsed and so surrendered, and we're not protesting, we're not marching, we're not staying vigilant the same way we were, and all this type of thing. There's now a sort of different idea and desire, and now we have this kind of impetus to, okay, we have to create, this new media community. I think that we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I don't want to keep you guys forever, but I want to close on this idea of one of the things about Rogan, Lex Friedman, all this type of thing is, and I know this because I have a lot of friends who are blue collar workers, that shit is on in workshops, warehouses, places of work across America every day, all the time, all this sort of thing. It's absolutely nonstop. I cannot think of another media personality, regardless of political affiliation, that has that type of consistent, constant reach into so many brains in so many places, sparking so many conversations, all this type of thing. I think that's probably the hardest thing to replicate. Not that everybody needs to have that type of reach, but I'm just saying in terms from a war of the brains perspective.
But on a grassroots level, not at all.
Yeah.
Right? Because what what the Friedmans and the Rogans are doing is they're creating the behavior,
Right.
but they're giving people junk food.
Right.
And there's a real opportunity to give them more relevant stuff, not at scale, not, at the million size audience, but through a diversity of podcasters that actually satisfies their needs in a much more fulfilling and holistic way. I could be wrong. Obviously I'm projecting here. Obviously this is the world I want, not just the world that I see. But that's why I think our next step, and this is where David, Cameron and I have both hosted a chapter. I am perfectly willing to host the next chapter if instead you want to say, I'll bring somebody, but Jesse, I'm not ready to host 6 people because, that might be a little over. But it's you've got first dibs. And I'd say we just reconvene again, but with 3 other people so that we go to 6. Because I think what you just raised as a question, Cameron, is a fascinating conversation unto itself that I'd love to hear other podcasters weigh in on.
Yeah, David, we'll close with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned that where the time seems right, and I would say from the feedback that I'm getting from folks, both listeners and people that haven't become listeners yet, are but they're finding out about the show. There is a hunger for this better information. People are sort of realizing that they're not being served by the information sources they have now. And I also want to point out something that may not be what anyone wants to hear either, is that, and I'm sure you experience this as well, Cameron, that you know a good messaging system is going to require lots of different media formats, styles, lots of things, right? Because even within what I do, and I don't do very much social media, but I have people that they get all they want out of my 30-second clips I put on Instagram. Like, that's enough. They're never going to listen
Yeah.
to a 45-minute podcast. And I have people that only
Many
read
such
the
cases
stuff I
right
write.
here in the Cameron Journal. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I have people that just read stuff I write. So they're fine just reading. That's what they're just going to read. And then I have people that listen to the longer format show. So and I think that one of the things I also noticed when it comes specifically to podcasts, like in the space where I'm working kind of this bridge building and a lot of that space and information literacy and things like that, most of the shows, quite frankly, are super boring, academic to academic, that go on for an hour and a half. And the only people that would listen to that show are other academics, right? No one's going to go through that for an hour and a half with all the jargon and everything that they're spewing. So, and again, those podcasts are fine. I'm not saying they should go away, but then we also need these more accessible ones, right? And that's one thing I'm trying to do, is make some of this information more accessible. You don't have to be, we're not going to teach you how to calculate p-values and do a t-test and all that kind of stuff. We're going to bring that information out without getting down to that level of nitty-grittiness. So I think all those things kind of fit into what we're saying. So I love this idea, though. But yeah, we have to, like you say, figure out what the next step is.
All right. Well, we're going to figure that out over email, and we'll be back with everybody on all this. If you will be, for those listening now, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. For those who will be listening to this later, when it gets posted sometime over the weekend, if you want to stay in touch, feel free to find any of us online. We're going to do plugs. I'll do mine last. So David, then Jesse, let us know where we can find you online and keep up with you.
Yeah, so the easiest way is all my stuff is at outrageoverload.net. If you sort of don't have a web browser, you just want to send me an email, you can also do that at outrageoverload@gmail.com. But all that contact info, all the info about the show, all the good stuff is on the website, outrageoverload.net.
I think Jesse Hirsh is the easiest way to find me. No C, because Jesse Hirsh with a C looks like me, is interested in the same subjects as me, but he's American and I'm Canadian. And you know what? There's a little bit of a difference.
Yes. Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Obviously, my name is Cameron Callan. This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. This has been a special live edition. Thank you all so much for listening. I really appreciate listening and watching. I really appreciate it. You can find all of my links, of course, at CameronJournal.com. Don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. It goes out every Saturday. And come back here on Monday. I was out of town on Monday this week, so no news hour. But this Monday upcoming, we will have the Cameron Journal News Hour. So thank you all so much for coming and watching. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cameron.